All right, everybody. The next thing to do is talk a little bit about building economic models, put us in the overall kind of uh, field of economic and economic analysis with this taxonomy, and then just expose you to some interesting models that have been used to study economic questions. Before I get started, I just want to remind you to get on the discussion board and fill up your introduction and also fill out the survey if there's anything I could do to help you with this class. Okay, gonna get going here. Economics models. Economists, policymakers use models to explain how individuals and firms allocate resources and how market prices are determined. Along with a whole bunch of other things. But these are like kind of the main things that we need to talk about in this class. A model, just more generally overall, is just a description of the relationship between two or more economic variables. And there's a lot of ways to use models, so it's a pretty flexible definition. Prices and quantities are the most basic economic variables used in the supply and demand model that you've probably seen in Econ 201, and will talk about a bunch of ways to use multiple prices and multiple quantities in this class. As I showed you in the last video, police and crime are two other variables that are like the topic of economic models. Taxes and output would be more macroeconomically minded, although microeconomic frameworks to be used as well. And a bunch of other disciplines also use models. Physics has like models of how gravity affects objects in the air. Foreign policy would, for instance, have models about how, or frameworks about how nations interact with one another. So it really can take on a broad set of things or models that are used to understand the relationship between two economic variables. So more like nitty gritty information is they need to predict how a change in one variable affects another variable. So it's kind of like this cause and effect notion that we were getting at with some of the last economic data slides. So I want to talk about the nuts and bolts of building a model. And one of those is that you kind of have to make simplifying assumptions. So say we want to predict how price decreases affect the quantity demanded of a specific good in like a supply and demand framework. So we know that many things can affect how much an individual values an object, things like income and preferences. But if all factors are modeled simultaneously, then the model is intractable, useless, and it's impossible to say how a change in one variable will affect another variable. And so that's why when you look at a demand curve in a supply and demand model, it doesn't also give you a third dimension for like preferences and a fourth dimension for the prices of other goods. You know, it's trying to make a very clear prediction about price and quantity demanded. And it's saying essentially that, or it's not saying, but in the background, something that's happening is there's a common simplifying assumption is that all else is equal on that demand curve. So if the price goes from 10 to 5, we assume that income hasn't changed and that the preferences haven't changed at the same time, that the quantity demanded is just changing because there's a lower price and now individuals demand more of it. So if you want to learn a little bit more about how ceteris paribus is in applied worlds, click this link. It's a very good economist on ceteris paribus. So sometimes this assumption is justifiable. Think about like an election changing the police presence in the context of the rational theory of crime. It's the likelihood that an election changes how you feel about disappointing your parents is unlikely. And so also, but sometimes the ceteris paribus assumption will not be that justifiable. For instance, if you're measuring education's effect on wages, if you don't include ability, you're omitting a very important third variable that you should try to take into account in your analysis. So assumptions, simplifying ones, help look through the binoculars at the part of the problem that we are interested in solving and gaining insight into. As if you're looking through these binoculars over the city here, you could see a very specific part of the city very clearly. And you could rotate the binoculars if you wanted to bring in tangential parts of the problem that you were studying. So it's kind of like assumptions help you look through these binoculars. The other most important thing that I would talk about is constraints when you build a model. So economics studies how individuals, firms, and societies allocate scarce resources among unlimited wants and needs. So society is constrained, and therefore the individuals and firms in them are also constrained. Scarce resources implies that all actors are constrained. And if you think that they're just so rich that it's impossible that they would be constrained, you can't deny that they only have 24 hours in a day. So they're at very least time constrained. I told an ex-girlfriend I would make time one time, and I was wrong. So most common and familiar constraint that people are familiar with is a budget constraint, and we'll use it quite often throughout the course, both in the context of individuals and firms. And a budget constraint just means that people have a limited income and firms have a limited budget with which to purchase inputs to produce things. So, even wealthy people has this. Like I would argue even like Jeff Bezos has a budget constraint. Ask someone making $20,000 what their biggest problem is. They'll say they can't make ends meet. Ask someone making $200,000, 10 times more. They'll say the same thing. The second most common constraint is time. So there's only 24 hours in a day. And you probably know by now that you can trade time for money. So in the end, they're really not that different. Time really is money. There really is no such thing as a free lunch. So that's kind of a corollary, interestingly. For 1 hour of lunch not paid for, you do give up an hour of wages or leisure to the next most valuable thing that you'd be doing. And that's an example of opportunity cost. So everything has opportunity cost. It's the highest value thing that you give up to obtain a good or service or do something. So a taxonomy of economic models, just to put you in the landscape of where we are and what we're doing. There's kind of economic analysis, kind of falls into two types, positive or normative, and then positive branches off into decision or game theory. You probably saw this positive and normative in Econ 201. We're going to be studying positive economic analysis, which is a study of what is. I'm not saying normative analysis doesn't have a place in some part of the world. I'm just saying that this class is going to be working on positive. The first one we work on is decision theory, and this is mostly unit 2. So people make decisions to maximize their utility or happiness and well-being, or to minimize how bad off, not good off they are. So to minimize their disutility. Firms minimize their costs or maximize production. A typical analysis assumes a budget constraint or a cost constraint for like a firm. People are probably constrained by budget constraints, so it seems pretty reasonable. You can include additional constraints like time for time in a day, or behavioral economics could include like a cognitive constraint where you have limited capacity to choose between things that are good and bad for you. It just makes the problem a little bit more complicated and how it is able to predict how a change in one variable affects another. You can think of this like very approximately as you versus the world or me versus the world. So if I'm just facing these prices and the income is I, then the optimal amount of good 1 is Q1 and the optimal amount of good 2 is Q2. Or if you're a firm, if labor costs W and it costs R for capital, and I need to produce Q bar of something, L star K star is my optimal bundle. And so decision theory will be kind of like the primary focus of this class for most of Unit 2. And people make decisions to maximize their utility, happiness, or well-being, or to minimize their disutility, like I said. And the difference here is that we're assuming that individual's utility is influenced by another person's decision. So there's this strategic interaction amongst individuals. And very approximately, you can think of it as you versus somebody else, although in game theory, it doesn't have to be that one person's gain is another person's loss. One person's gain, best action could also be the best action for another person. If person B does action Y, then the best action for me is move Y or Z. And if person B does action Z, then my best action is either Y or Z also. And this is kind of a symmetry thing, but it doesn't have to be. And we'll use this kind of framework or a method of an economic analysis to study markets where there aren't very many sellers, so there's only a couple players in a game that are kind of competing against each other. So just cool models that I think one we covered in the last set of slides is the rational crime model. And it's just that you commit a crime if it's worth it, if the marginal benefit is greater than the marginal cost. And then another important work in this is that you can affect crime either by increasing the likelihood that someone gets caught or increasing the fine that they pay if they get caught. And that's this legal marginal cost of crime equals the probability of detection times the penalty you will pay if you do get detected. And so what I think is an interesting insight about how this can be used is say you're trying to make a policy which keeps people from riding the subway without a pass. You're an economist, so you can just increase the fine for getting caught for riding the subway without a pass, or you can just do more patrols. And either way, the marginal cost of crime will go up. And so a lot of law has been influenced by it's easier to increase the penalty that someone pays than the probability of detection, because you have to pay somebody for the probability of detection. And so this has implications for law enforcement policies, policies about terrorism, policies about urban planning and cities. So it's an important theoretical model that predicts how people will behave and whether they commit crime. So I've used this as a model before, for instance, for Somalian pirate behavior. Supply and demand. I hope this looks familiar to you. So it's just about buyers and sellers trading in a market. It's the most simple theory for why transactions take place. And it makes some assumptions. You should have already know them. You should try to name some. Whether the assumptions are good or bad depends on the question you're asking or the market you're studying. So I won't say too much about this now. Another model in kind of public economic sphere is the rational voter model. So it's interested in studying why people vote, and there's the core of civics and political science, and that a pillar of democracy is people voting and being able to decide for themselves. And civics class has probably instilled this as a civic duty for you, but turnout is often low, and we're interested in explaining why. And people are also subject to thinking rationally about decisions like voting. And so people vote if the marginal benefit is greater than the marginal cost, where the marginal benefit is just how beneficial is it for you to decide the vote? And then also, what is your likelihood of being that deciding vote? And then plus some good feeling you have from fulfilling your civic duty. And you vote if those are higher than the cost of voting, like going to the polls or being informed about the issues. So I just put this bullet point that the probability of being the deciding vote is really low in large popular elections. And there's a whole literature on this that you could see these videos here for more of an explanation if you're interested in that. And these have implications for political science and planning campaigns, how do you get the voters that are going to vote for you out to vote so that you win an election. So it's really applicable. Health as human capital. So switching gears out of public kind of into health. This model is talking about why people choose to invest in their health. So it can be, kind of useful for a broad range of topics and areas. And it's just that people's happiness is some function of how healthy they are and how much they invest in their health, which is these two terms, and then also their consumption of some other good, which is the C term, in every point of their life or time period. So T equals 0 would be when you were born, and N would be when you die. So I don't know, there's a lot you can get out of this. One really interesting insight to me is that higher incomes can make you more or less healthy. And that's because your overall consumption and health consumption is influenced by how much money you make. So higher income means typically due to you having a higher hourly wage, so you can use those wages to buy more health related goods, but you also give up hours. You also give up more wages to invest an hour of health and an hour of time in your health. So um, because it's worth it to work for you, you don't spend as much time exercising, basically, something like that. Another economic model that's used to study health is the rational addiction model. I think it's like a pretty cool thing to like model economically. It's like tolerance and addiction to like, we want to know like, why are people consuming goods like cigarettes and other things that are bad for them? Like, why do people do this? So this just says that your utility is a function of how much you consume of this addictive good, C, how much addictive stock you have of that good. So it's like modeling your tolerance or like addiction to it. And then YT is your consumption of some non-addictive good, like a fruit smoothie or something. And your addiction depends on like how much you consume in the past, so C, and life cycle events. So like having a child would cause you to smoke less cigarettes, for example, because you don't want to like have some negative health effects of you smoking on your kid. And so has some interesting implications about like, are drug crackdowns going to be effective, because they only affect prices in the short run. And so like, if you're addicted in the long run, like it's not going to matter too much. So switching gears again, you can get into like urban issues, like how do you plan a city with economics. So this is a monocentric city model that's been used to study like why people locate at a certain point in a city. It just says that like their well-being is a consumption of like a function of like what type of housing and what their consumption of other goods is. And so this constraint here just says that their utility is constrained by like how much they have to pay to live farther away from the city, and how much, like X is the distance to the city, H is how much housing they buy, C is the cost of this consumption good, Y is their income, and then T is their transport cost to get to their job in the middle of the city, or in the city central business district, as it's called. And I don't want to get into it too much because there's like the polycentric city model, which is for like multi-centered cities. But this is just illustrating how it can be used to make predictions about how like changes in transport costs will affect like where people live, for instance. So it has these implications for urban planning. Public choice is just like politicians are also humans, and so they can be considered from this rational economic viewpoint. Politician satisfaction, they maximize society's welfare, but they might also like care about themselves outside of broader society. So this could be like, they could be considered like they want to be reelected, they want to maximize like the spending of the government, they want to maximize like their own power, they want to maximize like the ego boost they get from being in office. Like it can be a lot of things. I thought just like an interesting note would be that women are thought to be typically less corrupt, and so thought would be a good way to kind of combat corruption, as this Economics of Corruption book says. But anyway, so politicians' utility function could literally be written like, you know, some weight, some like positive weight, like alpha greater than 0 on how much they care about society's welfare, and like beta, like some positive weight, like greater than 0 about how much they care about their own well-being. I would argue that beta is probably greater than 0 for everyone, although like it's higher for some people compared to others, but just as a useful abstraction, like people care about themselves as well, and so beta is probably greater than 0. And so like we could even be more like specific with our model. And so like currently this alpha of greater than 0, beta greater than 0 assumption like doesn't put a lot of like restriction on the problem to like give you a more like intuitive insight. But if we just make alpha the same and change beta to 1 minus alpha and require alpha to be between 0 and 1, then it's easy to think of these as like percentage weights, like because they'll add to 1. So this could be like 50, like 0.5, 0.5, so they care equally about society welfare, or like 75, 25, so they care like 3/4 about society welfare and like 1/4 about themselves. It's just a way to make it more specific and intuitive to interpret. And I would just say that like, if you wanted, you could even substitute re-election for own well-being to make it even more concrete. To care like somewhat, at least some amount about being reelected. I argue that like, this is probably a pretty useful way for understanding how human politicians behave. This is even a more complicated model that I'm not going to dig into, but it's a game theory model, so I wanted to mention it. It's about like how governments, terrorists, and like the community like behave, and like how like given how their actions affect one another. And so like government, for instance, like wants less violence, and the things it can do are reduce violence using counterinsurgency or providing like services like I don't know, water projects, like to get people like piped water in their homes. Rebel groups, they want violence because it is costly. They attack the government, and the community just wants to be the best off that it can, and it can share information with the government if it chooses to. And this is a link here to the models and the paper that it's in, and some data analysis from Iraq about how the model can be tested with data. So I just want to wrap it up for you now. So economists, we're just using models to predict relationships between two variables in a really broad sense. Without the model, you couldn't like estimate, or it would be hard to interpret what the data told you without having a theoretical prediction for what you think or what the math and assumptions say should happen. Two important thoughts for how you should think about building models are they're simplifying assumptions, which are always in the background. Just think about whether those are good and which ones you need and don't need to gain insight into problems. And then constraints. So most often a budget or constraint, and sometimes a time constraint, and as long as others could be used, because all individuals are constrained, and we need to discipline the math to give realistic answers. Constraints help do that. This class, we're going to use positive analysis and some always, and then some decision or game theory. And these models have implications for other numerous fields. So you should be interested, if you're interested in like any wide, research area or topic area in general, like from health to labor to urban to, economics, education. So this class can instill the basics of how we use those theories to study, difficult problems. So do the assignments, and thanks for watching the video.